So good morning again, everyone, and welcome to today's session. CIWiL, as part of its support to work under the Jamaica Spotlight Initiative, is hosting the second community of practice, which focuses on the impact of gender-based violence on persons with disabilities. We are, of course, aware of the pervasiveness of gender-based violence in our countries around the region, but we have not necessarily always focused in on the intersections between disabilities, gender, and gender-based violence. We will do that today. It is my pleasure as a member of the CIWiL Regional Secretariat to introduce to us today's moderator, who will be taking us through this very important discussion. Michael Jackson is the Executive Director of Jamaicans for Justice, a non-profit human rights organization. Michael, who holds a master's degree in public policy and management, is an organization development specialist with over 12 years experience in human rights, HIV and AIDS, youth and education development, social enterprise development, and capacity building. Michael has conducted organizational assessments and implemented capacity building activities for some 100 NGOs across Jamaica, the Bahamas, and the Eastern Caribbean. I now hand us over to Michael.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this important initiative being undertaken by the Caribbean Women in Leadership, CIWiL. It certainly is a pleasure to be here to be discussing this important initiative with all of us on the call across 3 Caribbean islands for the most part. And if there are any other islanders, then certainly we welcome you to the family of the discussion that we're about to have. Now, we're having this conversation under the Spotlight Initiative, CSOs, which is civil society organization, community of practice. And the focus, of course, is disability inclusion in advocacy for gender-based violence prevention and response. Now, persons living with disabilities, they are such a vulnerable group. And despite that vulnerability, unfortunately, they're often the forgotten group or minority in a lot of the conversations that we have. And it is something that I hope we can course correct as we have the discussion here this morning. Now, you would have gotten the agenda and some of the things that we really want to look at. We're talking about gender-based violence, but what is the intersectionality with disability and the varying gender groups that we have within the LGBT population, but also focusing primarily on women, because we recognize that women are disproportionately affected. Though we recognize women are disproportionately affected, the group of people living with disabilities, we have to look at that carefully. And then we're going to have to start considering the different types of disabilities and how exactly it makes women in particular more vulnerable than the other. So those are some of the conversations that we're going to be having, with particular focus on seeing how best we can strengthen the capacity of those who are here with us to enable advocates and first responders, service providers to be a little bit more sensitive to the issues and then be more responsive going forward. Certainly, we want to maximize the theme, revealing opportunities, share best practices. And one of the critical things, because we're all one Caribbean, we want to see how best we can have that regional solidarity standing during our advocacy. So when one island is doing particular good in one area or not so good, we can join those forces and say, listen to us, government. We need to ensure that the minority groups that we all serve, they're protected not only in law, but certainly in the services that we provide. So I just want to say a particular welcome to all the participants here. And I'm going to have a discussion with our esteemed panelists. And let me start with Grenada. We have Ms. Caroline Pizarro, who's the representative of the Grenada National Council of the Disabled, the GNCD. We also have from Guyana, Miss Rosemary Ramit. I hope I'm not, mispronouncing your name at all. And she's the coordinator from the Women and Disability Network, the Guyana Council of Organizations for Persons with Disabilities. And from Jamaica, we have Mrs. Kimberly Sherlock Marriott Blake, who is the Executive Director of the Jamaica Association for the Deaf. And we also have Miss Marilyn McCoy from Jamaica as well. She's the Executive Director of the Jamaica Association on Intellectual Disability. But before I turn over to the panelists to introduce themselves, one of the things I want us to really look at, what are some of those international conventions to which our different islands are signatory to? For example, we have the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, against women, the CEDAW. How many of our countries are signatory? How adherent are they to the CEDAW resolution that we have signed onto? We have the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Are our countries signatory to that? And are they adhering to the principles of these conventions? We have the Beijing Platform Resolution adopted in 1995. Are we adhering to those principles? How exactly can we use these international conventions to say to our respective governments that we need to do more to protect our women and girls, and in particular, those living with disabilities? And I also want to move from the international conventions now to the laws that we have in our countries as we have these conversations. For example, in Jamaica, we had our Disabilities Act recently enacted after years of it being passed, 2014, but it's just in February. I say the Valentine's Day gift was given to Jamaica. It was enacted February 14, 2022 in Jamaica. And I'm sure our panelists will be talking about some of the gaps in implementation, though the law is now enforced. We can look at Guyana. They have their 2010 Guyana Persons with Disabilities Act. Are we adhering to the provisions within it? Are we doing enough? And the last I checked, there is no special act in Grenada. I stand corrected. But what other pieces of legislation protect persons with disabilities? So these are the conversations that we're going to be having. So I'm going to allow each panelist just a minute to say their names, the organization that they represent, and just quickly what exactly their organizations do. And I'm going to start with you, Ms. Pizar. Is Ms. Pizar here? Oh, she's not here as yet. So we're going to shift to Miss Rosemary, and Miss Rosemary can help me pronounce her name properly so I don't have to mispronounce it going forward.
Yes, it's Ramit.
Ramit, okay.
All right. Yes, so good morning again, everyone. My name is Rosemary Ramit, and well, first of all, I'm low vision, and I represent the Guyana Council of Organizations for Persons with Disabilities, and I'm the coordinator of the Women with Disabilities Network. Now, GCOPD, because it's a mouthful to say, GCOPD has been around for about 14 years, and it's the national umbrella body for persons with disabilities in Guyana. And its work includes advocacy and training, skills training across Guyana. So we have about 20 organizations for persons with disabilities who are members of GCOPD, and that is how our network functions. So we conduct training nationally, but through each individual OPD in Guyana. And as I said, we work on at the national level, we work at the community level to implement programs and projects to benefit persons with disabilities.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Let's check over to the Jamaica representatives. I'll start with you, Mrs. Marriott Blake.
Hi, morning, everyone. So Kimberly Sherlock Marriott Blake, I am the Executive Director, as was nicely noted by Mikel. The Jamaica Association for the Deaf is 84 years old. We are 85 next year. We are a national organization supporting education, social support, and community development of the deaf community and their families across the island. We manage 7 schools and units for the deaf. We work along with our Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities and other stakeholders and sector partners in addressing the needs of persons who are deaf, supporting their families, and providing assistance where possible when it comes to policy and development, when we look at the intersectionality of various components of just life itself, as well as when we begin to look at students and individuals that have multiple disabilities.
All right, thank you so much. Let us shift now to Ms. McCoy. Is Ms. McCoy with us?
She is online, Mikkel, but seems to be having some technical difficulties. She's dropping on and off, so I'll let you know when next I see her on.
All right, thank you. And Ms. Pazar is here now? No?
No.
Okay. All right. The agenda is set beautifully, I think, because it starts from the lived experiences of persons with disabilities and the issues that they face before you go into.
Sorry, Mikkel, Ms. McCoy is there. She's on audio only.
Okay, not a problem. Before I switch to Ms. McCoy, I just want to say that the agenda is set in a particular way where it starts with the lived experiences of persons with disabilities, understanding the different gender issues, if you will, that they face, the nuances, the discrimination in particular areas, the opportunities, before we get to the high level discussion around policies and then the services that are there, and then certainly the recommendations. So I want those who are listening in to pay keen attention to what is being said, so we can certainly learn from the esteemed panelists that we have. Ms. McCoy, good morning. If you're hearing, we just want to have you introduce yourself, your name, the organization that you represent, and just quickly tell us about the organization in a minute. All right, we're not getting anything from Ms. McCoy right now, so let's jump into the first discussion. And certainly when Ms. McCoy and Ms. Pazar joins us, then we will get their perspective. Now, the first discussion that we're going to be having for the next 15 minutes is around understanding the lived experiences of persons with disabilities. And I want the panelists, again, to pay keen attention to the gender issues. How are men affected versus women? How are our girls affected versus our boys, as you explain the conversation? So I'm going to start with you, Mr. Ramit. What is happening in Guyana? What are your constituents, your beneficiaries saying?
All right. Disability is, I would say it's more prominent now than it was 10 years ago. And that is as a result of the advocacy that the council or GCOPE has been doing over the past maybe 6 to 8 years. But what you'll find generally is, first of all, Guyana is a large geographic area. And so we have rural Guyana and we have Georgetown, the capital. And what you'll find is that persons with disabilities are still viewed through the charity-based lens. They are still viewed as recipients of welfare and, services. And for the most part, most persons with disabilities in Guyana are uneducated, they're unemployed, which inevitably leads to poverty, of which you'll find both men and women being susceptible to that kind of poverty in Guyana because of a lack of the necessary education and employment and skills training and things like that.
All right, we're going to have a conversation
sure.
about the access to education. But let me ask you, the geographic scope of Guyana, how does that impact access to services and how persons navigate that particular issue?
All right. Well, in the hinterland regions, transportation is a major issue because to traverse those areas, you either have to go by boat because many of the the passageways and the roadways and so on are impassable. So persons do not get to access services as they would out in Georgetown because of that fact. And because of the fact that when we look at persons with disabilities, they're unable to access health care and education and these things because of, you know, the major transportation issues. But when we come to Georgetown, you find that while the transportation issue is still present, it's different because transportation now is a hindrance in terms of the cost of transportation for persons with disabilities. And because of that, you find that they cannot access services as they would like. And this would be any kind of service we're talking about.
And I've been to Guyana on the boat, so I'm quite familiar with the boats. Mrs. Marriott Blake, I know you represent a particular group, but I know you're quite capable of painting the landscape of the overall disabilities group, if you will. Can you just walk us through some of those social issues, institutional barriers that exist in Jamaica?
So the disability sector is as diverse as one can imagine. And oftentimes what happens is that it is a little bit forgotten that there is that wide diversity within the sector. So we're talking about a population of individuals who, while there is still a charity approach that is taken by many, there are some persons with disabilities who have been able to stand, I would say, stand their ground in spaces that are of influence. We do realize that there are individuals who have physical disabilities and individuals who have visual impairments or blindness generally have a stronger voice, I would say, in certain environments. And that does help when we start to look at what the advocacy looks like. You know, we have a senator who's blind, and his advocacy would help in kind of pushing not just the needs of those with visual impairment, but some of the broader needs of persons with disabilities. Our Jamaica Council for Persons with Disabilities does put, you know, quite a bit of effort into advocating from the government side of things. And as you mentioned with the Disability Act, there was quite a bit of work done, not just with these organizations, but with the people with disabilities themselves. So there is that advocacy that happens on the ground. Unfortunately, you do have individuals with intellectual disabilities, individuals from the community of persons who are deaf and hard of hearing, and in many instances, persons with mental health issues that just don't get that opportunity to communicate in a broad way, I would say in a loud way that can make an impact. So you have the communication challenges that exist for persons with intellectual disabilities and for persons who are deaf. A number of our sidewalks are not wide enough. We have holes in the middle of the sidewalk. We have a number of, you know, towns that you have to walk in the road to be able to move around. And so the wide gamut of challenges, it really does to some extent depend on the disability that we're speaking about.
Yes.
So that's the first thing. On the education side, you do have a number of children who are not able to access education. We have the challenge of early identification being a real issue. And oftentimes, because of the issue of early identification, you will have individuals who could have been in a better position who just really are quite limited. We speak about our urban-rural divide. It exists. A number of the agencies have a base in Kingston as, you know, the main location, and you may have another base in Montego Bay, which is our second city. We do see where, because of development that has been happening, individuals are a little bit more present as our service providers, but the limitations in access to the facility or the service or the communication that's required is something that's a challenge. I would say on the gender side of things, sexual and reproductive health is definitely something that's a challenge. We have the attitudinal barrier that exists to persons being able to get services, but then we have awesome teams and support systems like the Jamaica AIDS Support for Life that does provide targeted interventions for the deaf in relation to, you know, AIDS, HIV, and sexual and reproductive health. So it's a wide gamut of challenges, but you know, I'm seeing a comment come up as data in the comments there, and yes, the data is a challenge. And a part of that data challenge is just the willingness of persons to come out and speak up about their disability.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. And, you know, we take certain things for granted. For example, we're in this session now, and we have 2 interpreters that are leading us through the dialogue. I've had conversations with nonprofit organizations that we say we're human rights and let's get this done. But sometimes we ourselves, we don't even remember that we need to ensure that we have interpreters for our sessions. And I had one nonprofit organization said to me, but Mikhail, we can't afford it. Nobody budgets for these things. How do we get it done? Though we're well-intended and we want to ensure that we're inclusive. We have Miss Marilyn McCoy with us now. Good morning, Miss McCoy. Not hearing you. You're still muted, I think. Miss McCoy, you're muted.
Oh, she's not muted. Mrs. McCoy. Let me see if I can get her to come.
Okay. All right, so let's continue the conversation until Ms. McCoy is able to speak. Some of the things that Mrs. Blake mentioned, Ms. Rami, let me come back to you around that rural-urban drift. And again, we are aware of the structure or the physical and the geographic landscape in Guyana. But are there resources, for example, for transportation, stipend, and so on, for your community to get access to where the services are located?
No, we don't have any, and accessibility is a major issue, and it's something that we're working on with the Organization for Persons with Visible Disabilities, because they're the most affected. And even though we have private transportation here in Guyana, there is no publicly operated transport system. And because of that, you don't have any accessible vehicles. And persons would have to rely on their public assistance, which is a meager $70 a month. And for some of them, that's their only source of income. And so I wouldn't necessarily call it any form of stipend or anything like that, because that also has to cover other expenses. So no, to your answer, we don't have any assistance in the form of stipends for transportation.
I started off that because COVID came. It's still here, but we say COVID gone, because I think it makes us feel a little bit better as we move along. But COVID came in 2020, and a lot of the challenges that we have outlined, including the very important transportation, would have certainly worsened during that time. How was the experience in Guyana for your community, your beneficiaries during COVID? Were the services accessible? Did you see anything worsen during that time? What was the response like?
All right. In some instances, things or services did become a bit more accessible because everything or almost everything went virtual. And so some persons, some wheelchair users were able to access their online shopping. They didn't have to go into store anymore. They got to access employment because employment went online. And in that case, yes, some things did become more accessible. But in other cases like healthcare and accessing GBB services, if we are to get specific, those things worsened because many of the transport systems stopped working because of COVID. And, nobody was going out anymore. Everybody was at home. And so what we found, and this was interesting because one of the biggest problems that came out of COVID for persons with disabilities, especially women, was that the rise in cases of violence in the home became more prominent. And that was when our attention at GCOPD was actually brought to that situation. So those women, they suffered a lot in the home as a result of COVID.
And the particular experiences, did they vary based on the type of disability? In terms of the
Yeah.
Okay, can you just quickly in about 30 seconds guide us through that?
Sure. Could you elaborate some more when you say the particular experiences?
So for example, a woman who is deaf, was that worse than someone who is blind or someone with an intellectual disability? Do you know of any variation between the experience?
Yes, I would say the severity of the violence that they experienced varied, and that was dependent upon their ability to move about. So for example, for a woman who's blind, you know, she was still able to leave her home. For a woman who's deaf, she was still able to leave her home. But for those with physical disabilities or wheelchair users, those were the women that we found, you know, were unable to leave, or those women who had caregivers, who were the abusers. Those were the women you found suffered more severe kinds of abuse or experienced more.
Thank
abuse.
you so much. Mrs. McCoy, are you not able to speak? Still not hearing. Mrs. Marriott Blake, what was the COVID experience like in the Jamaican landscape for persons with disabilities, in particular women?
I'll start with the education side of things. The impact on education was significant. So there were women who were on a good path to attaining certain educational, goals and being able to meet some achievements, particularly our younger girls who may have been doing short courses or, skills training to be able to move into employment. All of that would have been shut down. There was also the challenge that we had where I'm going to say our young men, quite a few of our young men who would have been in education or otherwise employed when COVID hit and people started cutting. In some instances, our young men were impacted by unemployment. And unfortunately, while we don't have all the data to back it, we do know that there were some young men who were quite quickly moved into the antisocial forms of income generation. We're going to just leave it as the antisocial forms of income generation. Because there is that comment or that belief that the police won't stop you. If you're deaf and they see that ID that says that you're deaf, they're not going to try to talk to you because then that becomes a potential area of a human rights issue if they violate your rights and so on. If they see you using a wheelchair, they may not stop you because they say, it's going to take him a little bit longer to get home, so we're not going to stress him out. So there was that sense that we know we do have some of our young men who would have been unfortunately carried into the antisocial forms of income generation in an effort to try and manage and support our households. For women, we have some cases that even before COVID of domestic violence that were just not being handled appropriately by our police forces. We have one incident in particular where an officer would have contacted the next of kin, who in this case was the perpetrator, and asked, could you help me to interpret what she's saying? I mean, that on a whole is just an issue. And so when COVID hit and the priorities, in some instances reasonably so, the priorities at a national level shifted to healthcare, there were some security concerns that just were not given the kind of support that was needed. We saw where child abuse was increasing in the instance of parents who really just felt very overwhelmed. For a number of the parents with children with disabilities, for them it was the longest time some of them would have spent with their kids, and so that sense of frustration, that inability to manage, and that anxiety in being able to provide the support that was needed, because a number of those additional therapies, play therapy, occupational therapy, physio, that all of that kind of went on hold. And so parents were at home just feeling very overwhelmed and frustrated. And that contributed to children being abused, unfortunately.
And let me interject here, because we've segued nicely into the second segment of the conversation in understanding gender disability and violence that the sector or the persons really experience. And Mrs. Barrett Blake spoke about child abuse and the abuse that persons suffered through and the response system. So we're going to be dissecting some of that. So let me ask you, Mrs. Marriott Blake, when you talk about child abuse, for example, was there a particular disability again? For example, a child with intellectual disability, a child who is autistic. Was that where you were seeing some of the abuse taking place?
Well, I haven't been able to see the data, but we, in dialogue with our sector partners, we see where the severity of the disability did have an impact on some of the challenges. And I'm going to say also dependent on the parents' acceptance of the disability.
Mm-hmm.
The parent who has for some time accepted that this is the reality that their child is living in, or their family is in. And so as a family, this is how we manage discipline, and this is how we support our child. That did make a difference. There are some parents, for example, I know for the students with intellectual disabilities, it was quite a bit of time before Marilyn and her team were able to really engage with some of the students. And that would impact, there are parents, the truth is many of the parents are not going to honestly and openly say, yes, I started abusing him, or I started abusing her. They're not going to say that, but you pick up on the things that are said in conversation when you're just checking in. But I know severity of disability generally does have an impact or influence the way in which we see the severity of the violence. And I would say the ability of the individual to stand up for themselves, whether in their own expression or their ability to move around. I do feel that point was made quite fairly. Individuals who would have the opportunity to leave home, who would have the opportunity to pop in headphones and ignore the world around them, because it was not just violence that was directly towards an individual, but just the violence in the home became a toxic environment for a number of persons to function in. And that now became a challenge as well. We have mothers with disabilities who may have been very happy to go to work, literally, physically go to work every day, send their kids out to school, and then they're being home for a year plus. The physical environment literally became a war zone, and many women didn't know how to handle that. Many persons didn't know how to manage that with their kids. So as it relates to which disability would have been more impacted, I think there is still quite a bit of data that we need to pull out. While appreciating that a number of these women and children may not feel comfortable speaking about it because they themselves may not see the violence as violence.
Yes.
They themselves may see it as discipline. They may see it as, this is me being me. I generally am a more forceful person. So this is my response to the situation. They may not see it as violence. We do see in some instances where some assistive aids may have been taken from children. I'm tired of you going out, I'm going to take this walker. I'm tired of you and this noise, I'm going to take these hearing aid, because without the hearing aid, you can't hear to a certain level for you to even need to be making so much noise. I'm tired of this stress, so you did see some level of that, but again, it is the data to really give us the concrete numbers. That's something that we don't quite have just yet.
I want to challenge us to at least even put those case studies together so persons really understand it, and we get greater levels of response from government and partners. Ms. McCoy, I really hope we can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely. We're happy. I think we should all give a round of applause for that.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you to just introduce your organization and just get straight into the meat of it, and
Yes.
explain to us how persons with intellectual disabilities are vulnerable to violence, and in particular, intimate partner violence. I really want us to start there with you.
Okay. Jade is an organization that has been around for over 60 years. That was actually started by a parent of a child with intellectual disability. We provide a variety of services. We provide special education. which is a joint program with the Ministry of Education. We have an island-wide network of schools that provide services to children between the ages of 6 to 21, children and young adults. We do have a network of adult services, a parent support program. We do a lot of public education, and we also have a assessment and therapy center. Jade, the population of persons with intellectual disability is often overlooked, as many would imagine. It's also called the invisible disability because many persons do not have the distinguishable features that will alert persons to the fact that they do have a challenge. The bottom line, however, in relation to sexual violence and persons with intellectual disabilities, it's a reality. A lot of the cases are usually not reported. And if they are captured in databases, for example, that do not have disaggregated data. So you know it is a person with a disability, but you don't necessarily know that it is someone with intellectual disability. And in a recent work done by the Victim Services Division in the Ministry of Justice, what they said, and I will just move into this, that they have noticed during COVID an increased number of sexual abuse cases for underage girls. We go right back to what I'm saying, is that this data is, however, not disaggregated.
Yes.
When you talk about persons with intellectual disabilities and the violence that is perpetrated towards them, then we talk about a case that needs immediate attention. We all know that they are prone, or they are more susceptible to abuse, sexual abuse. For example, and I like to reference the study that was done, the prevalence study that was done in 2016 in Jamaica, that reflected that 1 in every 4 Jamaicans experience intimate partner violence. However, we go right back to the same issue, that the data that is there is not disaggregated. So we are not in a better position to say that this percentage of persons will have intellectual disabilities. However, what we recognize, and this is the fact, that it exists and we need to do something about it. Training is very important. We have to look at how it is that we educate the persons who are collecting the data and who are the users of the data, so that whatever data is collected, that we do have some level of disaggregation, or the data is usable.
Yes, yes.
And we do not generalize. But the intimate partner relationship is an issue, and it is a case where a lot of times the person do not feel that they have the power to negotiate in those kinds of relationships. And what happens is that they accept the abuses that they get. For example, physical abuse, somebody may say, I deserve it because I'm not contributing to this relationship. I have to take this abuse because if I fight back, then this person is going to leave me and I'm going to be on my own trying to, make life. So it is a reality, but, and this group of persons need the support from all of us, the advocacy, because oftentimes their voices are not loud enough. They are not able to express themselves in ways that people can truly understand exactly what is going on with them. And so the advocates around persons with intellectual disability is critical to their survival. Yes.
We won't get to the Q&A in another few minutes. We haven't forgotten the participants. But I'm going to share a personal story in 15 seconds and ask you a question. My mother used to teach at School of Hope in St. Anne growing up. And I remember there was a case of a child I used to play with. And she expressed to me that her stepfather was touching her and it felt good. And something jumped out at me. I was about 8 years old or perhaps a little younger. And when I started talking to my friend some more, she said that her mom, he touches her and he hits her, but sometimes the mom reacts as if it's a play. So when I went to my mother and said to her what my friend told me, apparently the mother was also someone living with an intellectual disability. And this man would have been with the mother from the mother was a child. Do you know of instances such as these where you may have predators really putting themselves in that family situation to exploit the women living with disabilities in this particular instance?
It is a reality. And I know our social services department would give you instances of reports that have been made in relation to that kind of a scenario. I'll also tell you a story. I remember years ago, we had developed some BCC materials. Yeah. And it was looking at your rights, your body, you know, things that people you should allow to touch you and wear. And when we developed those materials, we actually distributed them to the young people. And I remember distinctly this mother who came in and she said, I was able to learn about the inappropriate touching of my husband on my daughter through the story. Because the young lady, it was done in a story form. And when the mother read the story to her, she said, Mommy, you know, she indicated that her father was doing exactly that to her. This is a reality right across Jamaica. The onus or the responsibility is on persons who know to do the reporting. And we usually do not have willing participants coming out to report those kinds of abuses in the family or abuses in the community, but it is a reality.
All right, thank you so much. A very sad reality, and you know, we can only reiterate the importance of us standing up for other persons who can't speak, who are voiceless in their own advocacy. And sometimes people do speak. They may not speak in a way that is readily appreciated or understood, but you know, I just want us to pay keen attention. Any questions from the participants? We can open the floor, raise of hands. I see comments.
I just want to add a point here. You know, there was a valid point that Rosemary had made earlier, just a challenge of the geographic reality. Yes. In Guyana, and I'm seeing that connection similar to in some of the points that Marilyn just made. So we have seen instances where in urban areas, the women with disabilities, particularly women who are deaf, may have a certain, let's call it a certain approach to life. There are certain expectations that they have, differing, of course, from the women in rural communities. We have had instances, you know, it shook me to the very core, hearing a gentleman who does not have a disability, indicating that he's really not bothered about anything this woman wants to complain about, because he knows she's not going anywhere. She come from country, she don't know no better, she barely go to school, and I give her the best life she's ever seen. Mm-hmm. And while at this point she's living in Kingston, she would have come into our office to express some concerns that were happening. She made some comments, and our team was a little concerned about what they were hearing in her family environment, only to then find that she would have been sent to Kingston to live with family to attend school after completing secondary education. And this family member, who would have gotten tired of having this young lady in the home, not unable to get a job, a gentleman in the community says, yeah, man, I like her, is a good young lady. The gentleman takes this young lady. She has now reached the point of it being on paper, common law relationship. And she thinks this is the best thing ever because God has sent her this great man.
Yeah.
Gives her everything she needs. Every now and again she get beat, and every now and again he will lash out at the children, but it's a great man because he's putting a roof over her head in an instant where she's unemployed. And it brings, while there will be urban women who have a similar thinking, what she's thinking is this young man is helping me from having to go back to country where nothing now go on.
Yes.
And so she's sitting in this environment knowing that it is not right. Unfortunately, there is that influence of religion on her thinking that this is what the Lord has provided to me. And it is just perpetuating the situation. You look at her children and you're seeing where the violence is being, meted out to her children as well. But in her mind, this is the best experience she will have. And it is unfortunate because she's not prepared to make reports.
Yes.
So we go back to that issue of will the women and the people speak up? She's not prepared to make reports because within herself, she has decided that this is the ideal circumstance for her.
And thanks so much. And it's a couple of things that you said. I see Mr. Surat's hand up, and I will soon come to you. And I just want to point out that what we have just articulated is an understanding of the different types of gender-based violence that persons experience, the economic issues, the psychological abuse, the physical, and we all know, I think Trinidad has one of the best legislation dealing with gender-based violence, because in Jamaica, ours is really limited to physical. And so it doesn't really capture the levels of abuse that our women in particular face. And we won't even go into the disabilities component now, because that's a whole different ballgame. So I think we have to recognize the different types of abuse that women face and how we can really deal with some of that. I'm going to read some comments from Erin in Bahamas. And she has been mentioning that violence is prevalent in the disabled communities, regardless of gender. She has articulated the importance of data. I think she was supporting a point that was raised earlier. And one of the important points that she raised that we're going to be having some discussion around quickly in the next section is around how does violence itself induce disabilities? And I think that's something to really have a quick discourse around. So she also mentioned unconscious bias affect the way we believe or respond to the allegations or reporting when they do come in. And that is something we're going to be having further conversations about when we get to the stage of duty bearers. And, at JFJ, we have so many unfortunate, I won't call them stories, lived experiences of the police lack of response. The duty bearers perpetuate those issues and the discrimination because they also share them. So we're going to be having those conversations a little bit more. Mr. Kenneth Surratt, please unmute and go ahead.
You hear me?
Yes, we're hearing.
Okay, so good day. Unfortunately, I joined a little late because I was in another meeting, but one of the issues we haven't pertaining to women who are blind, we have women in Trinidad who got blind, who blind and went to make a report to the police. And this idea of people believe information must only be gathered based on visual. So they will complain, they were raped, and so the police want to know. But how you could see, how you know who raped you,
Yes.
How could we get the police to be more sensitive and know that information gathering is not only visual? There are other ways to gather information. How that could be a consideration, and how could we work it for persons who are blind and dealing with the police in reporting gender-based violence?
Thank you so much. We're going to explore what you just articulated in a few minutes. Ms. Nugent?
Yes, good day. Myself, I joined late, but I really appreciate this conversation that we are having, because I must say I have my sister, she's deaf, and she has experienced a lot as well. And even currently, she we have to pull her out of the working world. As a matter of fact, she was with an organization that, or should I put it now, an organization that caters for disabilities, specifically of the deaf, of course. And when we have cases where, in terms of gender-based violence, where it's someone with a disability who is the perpetrator and a person with a disability who is the victim, or we deal with that. And not only that, I heard my colleague just mention about, oh, we have the police. We're looking at, for example, she's deaf, and if she wants to file a complaint, the police is not equipped with that sort of, with an interpretation skill to understand and to even record whatever she's trying to say. And I was, as a matter of fact, when I was doing my master's degree, that because of my reality, because I have it in my family, one of the policy that I think about writing on is how we can get person within the working environment, or to know the language of the deaf, not just the deaf, of course, but I'm just speaking to my reality now, know the language of the deaf. So we were thinking about if we could have, and probably that's something we can advocate for, where we can have in the school, just as you have French, Spanish as a second language, or something that you have to look at to take on as a mandatory language, where persons now across the spectrum can have this knowledge of communicating with the deaf, so that even when they are in the workplace, they can communicate with them. Because we really have to pull her now and have her at home, which is not economically good for her, because person within the workplace would find her to be aggressive when she's really not. She's just trying to communicate, and they do not understand what she's saying. She does not understand what they are saying. So therefore, sometimes that comes off as aggression, and because they do not have the skills and the know-how to deal with that, they are actually facing abuse in that era. So that is something we can explore as well. But I really appreciate this conversation because it speaks to my reality.
Thank you so much. And I hope we can share some of these ideas. I also see Dr. Cummings in the chat saying that the examples that were given earlier really forces her to deduce that dysfunctional family systems are also responsible for abuse of all types, for those living with disabilities, whether it is by mere consent or neglect. And I see Ms. Erin Brown agreeing and indicating that we need to increase emergency reporting by integrating the modes of telecommunications and disability inclusion training for first responders, armed forces, medical services provider, etc. And it segues nicely into our next conversation. So I think we're still in the week of celebrating and speaking about the opportunities, the challenges, the recommendations for persons living with disabilities. And the theme for this year's International Day for People with Disabilities is transformative solutions for inclusive development, the role of innovation in fueling an accessible and equitable world. So how can we ensure that there is equal opportunities and access for those who are living with disabilities? And I want us to think about the services that we do as organizations. I want us to think about the institutional barriers that people with disabilities face. I have to ensure that in this setting here, I act as moderator and I don't cross the line, because there's so many things that comes across my desk, even at JFJ, when I was at Jamaica AIDS Support for Life. And as I stated, my mother was a teacher at School of Hope. So I played with children, and maybe that's why I'm a little bit more biased towards those with intellectual disabilities, because the horror stories that you experience or hear, it really is heartbreaking. But when you look at it, how is there ease of access to the police when the reports are being made? How do you talk about access to justice? How do you talk about access to health care? Are we in our own bias saying that someone with disabilities can't even consent to sex when it is that they're an adult? So even those sexual and reproductive health issues we're going to be talking about. What about the family? What is the responsibility of family? What is the responsibility of communities? Within Jamaica, I tell you, we use some discriminatory language all the time, and I know it's spread across the Caribbean, because one thing, our mindset, it's quite similar. We see someone with a disability and you call them wani, mad smuddy. Those are the derogatory language that we use. How do we challenge these things? How do we really get the community and society to be a little bit more responsive? So I'm going to ask each participant, the panelists, to indicate 2 to 3 interventions that your own organizations undertake that we can replicate before we get into the external. I think we have to start here, what we do, and then we can shift the recommendations to the other duty bearers like your police, your healthcare workers, the education, and so on. So I will start with you, Ms. Ramit. What do you do in terms of, these are the 2 to 3 interventions that I am suggesting that the participants can look at as innovative solutions, best practices that are worth considering for replication.
All right, so the first one that comes to mind would be consultations, because number one, this is the biggest challenge we've been having here in Guyana, is where you have programs, mainstream programs, and they do not cater to women with disabilities or persons with disabilities because we are not included in the consultation process. For example, we have the iMatter app, which is an app that gives you information about GBV services here in Guyana. The disability community was not consulted when they were developing that app to see if the app was accessible. I know that the ministry is working on building accessible shelters. Persons with disabilities who would in the end be the users are not consulted to see if the accessibility of the building even caters to the needs of those persons. And we have been pushing and trying to insert ourselves in all of these different areas to ensure that persons with disabilities are included and that they're consulted when these different programs are being developed. The second point is within our community, what we are working on is creating advocates within our own community. Because what we find is that in Region 4 in Georgetown, you'll have loud advocates, right? But in the other regions, in Region 6, Region 5, Region 10, what you'll find is that those women are not as empowered. And because of that, there's a lack of support persons in those areas. And we are also focusing on young persons, bringing young people out, educating them on their rights as persons with disabilities, on their rights as citizens of Guyana, and on the various legislations that we have here in Guyana, because we want to create advocates and support persons within the different regions who will then be the voice for the women who would have these experiences. So those are the 2 that I would say.
All right, thank you so much. And I really like the point around creating advocates, because nothing beats self-representation, speaking for your own issues, because yes, it's all about empowerment. And I think when our parliamentarians in particular hear the lived experiences of the different groups that we serve, they are forced to listen than when you have, you know, some of us who they would simply call, and this is a language that our parliamentarians in Jamaica use when they're upset with us, mere academia. That's what they say in the public space when they want to dismiss us in Jamaica as advocates. So I really believe self-representation is something really I would encourage every organization and community groups to replicate. I will go next to you, Mrs. Marriott Blake.
So I've kind of jotted down and put the interventions in 3 different buckets, if you will. One is as it relates to school level advocacy efforts. So we would have over the last few years, we did a project on child abuse, which helps to explain to our young people what child abuse looked like. Also provided some level of support to parents to explain to them what it looked like, trying to break down some of those cultural barriers and cultural norms that result in child abuse at the level of primary, preschool, primary, and secondary. That led us to a project on gender-based violence. So we did a similar project focusing more on our older students because we were hearing things like the family violence don't really count as child abuse. The child abuse is directly to the child, and so we went into a whole thing around gender-based violence and family violence that we had done an intervention with our students in school. We would have also done some efforts in helping the kids to understand just their rights generally. What are your rights as an individual? And we're not talking about rights as a person with a disability. What are your human rights? And having the young people understand a bit more what those human rights really look like when we start to exist within the wider community. And those projects really gave us, I'm going to say, a group of young people who are advocates, prepared to engage at a youth parliament level. And it really did shift when our youth parliament in Jamaica was, when we restarted youth parliament and you had 2 deaf advocates as a part of the team championing the cause for students and young people with disabilities. So that's the first set of interventions to address violence, because the reality is that we have seen, when you look at some of the literature, that violence is accepted oftentimes by persons who don't have that sense of self and that self-worth. And so that's a critical bit of the work, because a number of our young people do not have that encouragement. And school is a perfect place to do it, because they're there 5 days a week, however many hours, it being a part of that environment. I don't want to say hidden curriculum, but a part of the hidden curriculum is a critical bit of work that has been very successful for us. The second level of work in addressing violence, and as a major intervention that we've done, is engagement with critical partners. We have a strong relationship with the courts in Jamaica. We provide interpreting to the courts. We still have some work to do when it comes to the police, and we do recognize that those sit as different arms of the judiciary. In our case, they do sit in very different ministries, and so there is a level of advocacy still to be done with the police. But we are proud to say that if a deaf person needs to go to court, an interpreter will be provided, because we have a clear system in place for that. Similarly, we have a system in place with the Child Protection and Family Service Agency that in the event of child abuse, we have addressed a system to ensure that a child is able to get access to an interpreter, so that an incident, as was mentioned, of abuse doesn't get swept under the carpet, because there is someone who appropriately can communicate to gather the information from that child. So there is still advocacy to be done, but it's the partnerships that can make a difference in helping to ensure that when the unfortunate does happen, the access to get redress is in place. And the third one is
Kimberly. Before you move on, I was having a conversation with a parliamentarian recently about the Jamaican Constitution, the right to be spoken to in a language that you understand. And I'm like, you're reaching people's constitutional rights. And they said, no, that's not what the Constitution contemplates. But I'm saying, what exactly contemplates then? English versus Patois? I don't understand.
Exactly.
And I challenge them completely that what they're doing is neglecting and reneging on their responsibility as a country in what the laws do actually accommodate. So I sorry to cut you, but I say Erin passionately saying disability justice and Jamaicans want justice. I think it's an important to have in terms of grounding these things in law, and for parliamentarians to recognize that we are providing a service that they
should be doing.
Yes, so sorry to cut you, but continue.
No, and that's actually the reason why we focus on human rights, because what we don't want is for our students to believe that their rights are a special kind of rights only for these people over here. We're trying to ensure that they understand that they have a right as a human to access. They have the right as a human to education. They have the right as a human to fair justice. It's not a special right for the people over here that fit into this little box. It's a general right. And having them understand what that means and how that pans out in their experiences is valuable. But then that third component of work is having our students and their parents and our teachers understand disability. And that's important because when we start talking about a person with a disability being violent to another person with a disability, we can't ignore that bit. You know, we can't ignore that very critical piece that we do have violence that is being both perpetration and victim being someone with a disability. And so that provision of knowledge in relation to what does disability look like? What does that spectrum and that, you know, diversity within disability look like? We have seen instances where young men will want to be violent to other young women, both deaf, because the young woman happens to like a young man that is not deaf. And they feel, how dare you come out of this, the community? There are a few of us here and we need to band together. And we see where women are being experiencing violence because there is a deaf young man who liked her who never got the chance. You know, that level of knowledge in just helping our parents to understand disability, because they can be excellent advocates, and helping our young people. You are deaf, but you are in a position to advocate for someone who has an intellectual disability, someone who is blind, someone who uses a wheelchair. That level of work is something else that we've been doing. And I can happily say that we have some parent advocates that you would think they have the PhD in, because when they're done spitting their lived experience, you know, Kimberly Nugent, just the way she expressed, that's the kind of advocate we're looking for. When we look at the families being able to advocate, it's not just about the child you have or the child you know, but as a member of the extended community, being able to advocate for the community.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm going to shift to Jade.
Okay, what I will do is 3 main areas. For us, the whole issue of self-advocacy is critical. This is a population of people who have significant limitations in expressing self, and therefore the training has to be carried out in order to build their capacity to do that. What Jade embarked on a few years ago was the development of a curriculum that focuses on what we call self-determination skills. Self-advocacy is one of those skills. And we introduce that in the school system so that it doesn't begin after they leave school, but it actually starts within the school setting to build their capacity, to talk about things that impact them. But critical among that is the whole issue of them representing themselves. In the past, we have always been the voice for persons with intellectual disability. The paradigm shift right now is for them to articulate their issues in however minimal words that they can do it, but they need to learn how to talk about the issues that impact their lives. And to do that, not in a friend exchange, but to sit on committees, to sit on boards, to be able to do that. And that has been a major activity for us. We have had clubs that we call our adult leadership clubs, where we give them an opportunity to man those clubs by themselves with support. So they do everything. They go out, they advocate in the community, they do their fundraising, all of those things, empowering them to be their own voice. In addition to that, employment is one of those issues that impact the lives of people with intellectual disabilities in a real way, negatively in some ways, when they do not have the opportunities to be employed. And so a lot of exploitation and abuse happens when these persons are home and not engaged. And so a lot of our efforts have been to build the capacity of the organization to support our young people in areas of employment. We have partnered with other agencies, other organizations to implement employment support programs out there, But we all know that projects have a lifespan. So what we have started to do is to organize our own initiatives right here at Jade, where we can begin to build the capacity of our school leavers. We have at least 2 social enterprises where young people get the real life training and produce items for sale or distribution to the wider community. In addition to the social enterprises, we have what we call our apprenticeship programs, where a few of our school leavers get the opportunity to work alongside persons without disabilities in our 5 main schools. And they are in that program for approximately 2 years. After they leave, the idea is for them now to seek employment, or us to support them into employment in the open market. So employment is critical to us, and let me tell you how critical it is. When we do our actual employment placement, we may have in any 1 year approximately 5 people being employed. I can share the experience of a program that we implemented with the Ministry of Labor. And I think the funding was from World Bank or the Japan agency. And in 1 year, we were able to place approximately 70 young people across the island in business enterprises. And in that first year, we saw an increase of full-time employment to 40%. Remember, we're coming from 5. So we have, and what we did, we put in an element that we know is critical to them maintaining the job. And that is what we call our job coaching element. That has worked. And that is to us a best practice that we'd like to see replicated with government support, because that's one way to improve their visibility in employment. And the other one is stakeholder disability sensitization. We cannot overstate this. We have worked with the justice system. We have worked with the Ministry of Health. We have worked with other education agencies to ensure that people understand how to work with persons with intellectual disabilities. People understand how to support them more so that they can live fulfilled lives. And that's the ultimate aim of every single adult, is to enjoy the best quality of life. And so whatever we put in place is aimed at allowing them to enjoy that good life, but allowing them to be participating in their communities.
All right, great. Thank you so much. I'm going to summarize some very key things that I heard earlier, but that will be towards the end. I've taken some notes. At this stage, I think we're all aware of the Spotlight Initiative, and whether or not we are recipients of the grant, I think there is that firm understanding of what Spotlight Initiative intends to do. And they have what I can call a best practice. So whether or not some element of it existed before, they have certainly scaled up the knowledge and the capacity of different groups around it. The referral pathway. The reason for the referral pathway being important is because it really does outline and detail the steps of the way social support services that are provided across NGOs like ours, as well as governmental organizations, yes? So when you're talking about gender-based violence, it really says that if someone is experiencing GBV, then you look at the legal and redress component. But for example, we said at JFJ, you can send a client to us if there are other issues are not met, because I tell you, you're not ready for courtroom yet, if it is that you're still in the abusive relationship. So what are those safety plans that we need to develop? How do you make referral to a shelter? How do you get to that stage of the self-empowerment, the economic issues that you all outline? So I think my first question is, how has the Spotlight Initiative enabled some of the work that you have all been doing around gender-based violence, and is the model responsive to persons with disabilities? And I will start with you, Ms. Ramit.
All right. Well, GCOPD has been approved of the Spotlight Initiative. Yes, my internet was buffering just, and that's why. Yes. So GCOPD has been approved for one of the Spotlight Initiative small grants. And the work that we plan to do with that, when the finances does come through, is to build a capacity of our women with disabilities in mostly Region 6, because that's where we find the experiences coming out of. And we also want to work with the service providers to ensure that their capacity is built on how to interact with and communicate with women with disabilities. Now, when we look at mainstream programs, so let's say an organization that supports women who experience GBV, we want to work with those other organizations to see how we can make disability inclusion a part of the services that they provide, so that it isn't only provided for women without disabilities. So that is a gap that we're trying to bridge at the moment, because, and I heard you mention it before, that you'll have these organizations that preach about human rights, but then at the end of the day, we find that disability is excluded. And whenever disability is included, it's really just to check a box to say that, yeah, we included 1 and 2 women with disability and things like that. So that's a gap that we're really working to bridge and to strengthen the relationships that we have, so that our women with disabilities can also benefit from whatever Spotlight Initiative grants would have been allocated to these other organizations. They could also be a part of the population that these organizations serve.
All right, perfectly said, because what you have done is to articulate what measures you're taking as an organization to ensure that gender-based violence is certainly a strategic objective of the work that you do as you implement. Mrs. Marriott Blake, over to you. If you remember the question, I hope.
Oh yes, in relation to Spotlight and the work that we have been able to execute with the support of Spotlight. So 2 things that are very important for us is, 1, being able to use the name Spotlight did make a difference in engagement that we had executed. So under the Spotlight activity that we had, under that project, what we did was bring in some of the stakeholders who, based on the lived experience and the GBV experiences of deaf women, these are the stakeholders that we needed to get in to fix things. So we had a session that did not, we very pointedly asked, please do not send the decision maker in your organization. Send us the customer-facing person. I don't want to talk to the head of know nothing. That person can't help me, because when a deaf person comes in, that's not who they're seeing. So we had a number of deaf women, some deaf boys, some deaf men, sharing the experiences they had, engaging with some of these stakeholders. We recorded their experiences, they shared them in the session. We basically had, let's call it a sensitization to the world of deaf culture, a sensitization that spoke to the realities that a deaf person is experiencing when it comes on to communication. We shared some critical information as to how communication from a people first perspective. So it's not who would rape this deaf person anyway. It's okay, let me try to be able to connect with this individual to ensure that I can collect the right information and provide the right support. And then we shared those experiences that the deaf women and deaf community members had. And there were people in the session that were shook. Mm-hmm. When we pointed out over and over again in the session that we have police, you know, that 119 system that is not accessible to the deaf. They're, wow. But it did make a difference in their engagement. They said, wow. So we basically set up a situation in a number of different meetings with them, small group sessions, to have them really understand the reality that a deaf person is dealing with. We took them through, so, you know, the process of, so someone comes into your office to get support. What does that mean? What does that look like? And they would explain to you their process, and then we say, okay, hold on. If I was deaf, do you realize that first point of call there, you cannot provide me with a service? And for many persons, it was, never thought of that. Whether it is that the system in their office is a number calling system where they're going to shout out, now see number 7. You know, if number 7 happens to be a deaf person, then they're not going to know. From the fact that it's a calling to make an appointment to see someone, or when you get in, it's okay, well, we only see deaf people on this day, but the only people that know that they only see deaf person on that day is the people within the office, not the deaf community themselves. It really was an eye-opening session, and we were able to pull out of that the report that speaks to where the gaps are, not just the gaps in the system, but the gaps in knowledge for the deaf community, the gaps in knowledge and experience and training, I would say, that we on the side of the association need to do to be able to better support the community and better liaise with the agency. So it really was an eye-opening set of sessions. And I think we are, well, coming out of that, we got quite a number of requests for sensitization, you know, greater learning of sign language on the parts of some of the stakeholders. And for some of them, I think we now have a few more advocacy partners, because when the person at the client facing realized it's a policy issue, it's a ministry level issue, they were like, no, I have to carry this to my supervisor, my director, because it made me look bad. And I don't like that I look bad. So we need to work together. And that really was, has been a very beneficial session. To this day, there are stakeholders who were able to engage very positively because of that.
Thank you so much. Ms. McCoy?
I, unfortunately, cannot talk about the support from Spotlight, since we have never implemented a program under that project, under the organization arm. However, we understand the importance of GBV and persons with intellectual disabilities. So when the communication comes to us from Spotlight, we present ourselves. We have participated in the midterm assessment, you know, just giving data about our population. We also were at the table when the launch of the HFLE GBV prevention materials was done, because we recognize that this is an area that we need to strengthen in our organization. We look forward to the next step, which is actually the support through Spotlight. So we await that.
McCoy, you're like me. I would have said it the same way. We look forward to the support. That's how we roll, right? But I'm going to ask persons just for a little bit more time. This particular section is slated to end at 11:30, but we started a little bit late, and the conversation is really going, and there's some key points I want to touch on before we close out on this particular segment. I want us to explore quickly around the social support components, cash conditionality support from your Ministry of Labor and Social Security. And then I want to get into some specific sectors, and I'm going to split the responsibilities across the persons here. But I'm going to give you 1 minute each just to guide us through. Is enough being done by the responsible ministries, whether or not it's the Ministry of Labor and Social Security or the equivalent for you, Ms. Ramit, in your country, in terms of social support, you know, reducing the amount of funds that persons with disabilities have to pay over for healthcare, for transportation, cash conditionalities, you know, programs. Is enough being done? from your respective ministries. So I'll start with you, Ms. Ramit, as usual.
The
What
short
can
answer
improve? Yes.
is no, enough is not being done. And that is clear in the situation that we currently see with women with disabilities and their experiences with GBV. Now, with that being said, some things are being done. For example, we have the Ministry of Human Services and Social Security. They have their, I think it's their Women Initiative training, where some women with disabilities can benefit from that. They have a difficult circumstances unit where we see women who, want to maybe do something, purchase equipment for a small business, whatever they need assistance with, they do provide some form of financial assistance. We have the public assistance, as I mentioned, which they will start the term as a disability grant. But the thing is that women with disabilities will rarely try to access these services because of the whole attitudinal barrier that presents itself when they go to access these services. Women who are deaf are unable to communicate. Women with intellectual disabilities are not taken seriously. Women who are blind are not taken seriously. Women who are wheelchair users can't even access the building to go and access these services. And so GCOPD has been tasked with trying to implement these initiatives in a way that is accessible and is able to reach the women. And I'll give you a typical example. So the Ministry of Human Services, in their budget, I think for the budget last year, they allocated some money to do training specifically for persons with disabilities. Now the ministry is complaining that they're not getting the participants. They're not getting the numbers of persons interested. Now, when GCOPD implements training, we always get the numbers. And the reason for that is because the trainings that are currently being conducted by the ministry is over a 3-day period. How can you learn sewing over a 3-day period? How can you learn to use the computer and technology over a 3-day period? And so these are the things that we are hoping to be addressed. And that is why at the beginning I said consultations are necessary, because when you make decisions on our behalf and we don't even want to use the things that you're providing to us, you cannot then turn around and say that persons with disabilities are not willing to use the services, because we're not being consulted in terms of what it is we want. Where are the areas that we need assistance, right? So on that note, the Ministry of Labor, through the Board of Industrial Training, does provide training specifically, and that's what I mentioned earlier. Now that training is given over a 3-month period. They are being certified. And another issue that we have with the Ministry of Human Services is that we ask them, are you going to subsidize transportation? Because you're asking these women to leave their homes, come to the training site, use their own money, which they don't even have, to pay for transportation. So are you going to subsidize? And the answer was no, we cannot give them back transportation money. So how can you expect these women to come out when you can't even give them back their transportation money? So the Ministry of Labor, through their training program, that is what they're doing. They're giving a monthly stipend. The women are given certificates, and so they're able to access that training.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So all of these exclusionary criteria before you can even access the services. Mrs. Maribel, you had something else, Ms. Rabbit?
No, and that's why I keep saying that we need consultations, because for example, the Ministry of Human Services, another initiative that they did was that they removed the needs assessment in order to access the public assistance. So as long as you have a permanent disability and you have the medical certificate, you will have lifetime access to the public assistance. The board that reviews these applications, none of the board members have disabilities, and they all have a medical background. And we know the challenge now that will now bring up, because now you have these people who view disability through a medical lens and not a human, right, and not a human rights lens. And so that's another issue because we don't even have people who are like us representing us on these boards, you know. So while there are things being implemented, it's not done through a consultative process, and that is where we have the issue.
Right. Thank you so much. Mrs. Marriott Blake, Jamaica Social Protection.
The short answer is no, right? I don't think I could say echoing everything that Rosemary said. But in addition to that, for us, we have a real issue where we have, I'm going to say that on paper, we have a very strong system for social support. I will take whatever stoning comes with that statement, but I do believe fundamentally on paper, Jamaica has a very good system for social support. What we don't have is very good implementation to ensure that it is consistent and truly accessible. And so you were asking if the relevant ministry, and I am that person who believes that it is not one ministry's job. Because let us look at our PATH program. Our PATH program that is providing support, accessing to education. First of all, a child who is on PATH under the disability criteria gets less money than a child who is on PATH for the health criteria or the education criteria. Right? And you can't be on PATH for more than one criteria. So that already is a systemic challenge that just does not make sense.
So it doesn't deal with the multi-layered issue at all?
You get on for one thing. And the amount that is given for the child who is on PATH for disability is actually lower than the amount for education. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that you have people who are applying for PATH on a routine basis, religiously, whether it is every 6 months or every year, because they just can't seem to get approved. People who are blatantly in need just can't get to be approved. So you will have, and after a while they get fatigued. I have one parent who boasts that it's 15 times now she applied. And I'm saying to her, that's really not something to boast about. But I understand she's at the point now where she's saying she's not applying anymore because you apply 15 times for this child and you're not able to get it. She'll figure it out another way, right? Similar issue exists with transportation. Yes, we do have a subsidized system for transportation to provide access to someone with a disability. But one, we have very few buses that are accessible. And two, it is concentrated in the Kingston metropolitan area. So I will have a student who lives 2 parishes over. So I have, for example, a student who lives, I'm going to get specific with the geographics here, in Bugwalk. There is no relevant support that the child can get from Bugwalk to the nearest location that the urban, transit company has their bus route. And so the child has to be paying the full price at a special rate because, the use of the wheelchair is being charged as an additional item to be carried in this vehicle. And now you're looking, it exists, but it's definitely not adequate. Then if we're to look at health, our health services are not accessible. The systems are not inclusive. And while we do have, efforts being made towards patient care policies, we still have an issue where there are not an adequate number of providers in the system that can give the relevant services to persons with disabilities. So you have one audiologist, you have one therapist in this region, and the region is 4 or 5 parishes. It is just not accessible enough. And so oftentimes the health assessment is required for you to get the registration under the Council for Persons with Disabilities. And you have individuals that will be waiting months to get that assessment done, years even to get the assessment done. Let's not even go into the path of for you to be able to benefit from the time and a half, if you will, that is offered to the Ministry of Education. Relevant assessments need to be done. You will be on that list for a year and a half before you can get the assessment done. So, and then in the education space as well, you have training being offered through our national training institution for free at the level 1, but there is no access to an interpreter. So that's why I'm saying I don't see it as a one ministry's job. If we're really to try and ensure that the relevant support is being given, it is very multi-agency, multi-ministerial work. And on paper, they have the systems that can provide support, but in practice, we're not seeing it in a real and tangible way for persons with disabilities.
All right, thank you so much. Ms. McCoy, over to you.
I concur. I could say ditto and stop, but I'll emphasize the importance of these social protection systems or programs to persons with intellectual disabilities, support to families, support to children. And I talk about the PATH program all the time, and we share a similar experience to Kimberly, where parents have been trying, parents and families who are really in need of the support, but are unable to be enrolled in these programs. The truth is, a person with a disability is vulnerable, as the other groups of people that the PATH program is seeking to provide support to. But the person with the disability will experience greater vulnerability as a result of his or her disability. And therefore, I do believe that more effort should be placed on targeting persons with disabilities for inclusion in these programs. Because we do not have, yes, we may have some additional programs that people can benefit from, but the truth is that their geographic location will present a barrier as well, because not everybody lives in Kingston. We do not have regional support centers for these support programs, therapies, and so on. And so for somebody over there in Trelawney, will have to necessarily journey into Kingston, somebody from Portland coming into Kingston to access these services. So all I'm saying is that if we're talking about disability inclusion, we need to seriously look at how it is that we can target in a very realistic way persons who really, truly need the support for inclusion in these programs.
And I'm happy you all said it. There are multi-level issues that really affect persons, the type of disability, how severe it is, and everything, of course, is exacerbated by poverty. So that is something. I'm just going to ask you each in just 45 seconds, absolute 45 seconds, to answer a question before we segue into the Q&A from the participants, because we're a little bit out of time for this. What recommendation would you make to this particular area that I will pose to each of you? So starting with you, Ms. Ramit, within Guyana, what recommendation would you make to the health sector to be more inclusive for persons with disability, especially for women who are experiencing violence?
All right. The first thing is that disability is not only a medical condition, right? It's a social condition that arises because of all the barriers that these women experiences. And so my recommendation would be mainstreaming disability inclusion in all the programs that are created, in all the policies that are developed. Disability inclusion has to be mainstreamed in that, because what we'll find is that these women are not able to access healthcare items. They're not able to access education on sexual reproductive health. And so my recommendation would be just that disability inclusion does not have to be viewed as a separate issue or a separate thing to deal with. It has to be mainstream into the programs of policies.
All right, thank you. Mrs. Marriott Blake, the police. Since you've been doing quite a bit of work around access to justice, what would you recommend to the police?
Well, the first thing is training. Training is critical, and it's not training one-off when someone is in academy. Training that is consistent, that is routine, that is ensuring that there is a level of, I wouldn't say respect, but there has to be a benchmark that is a minimum standard for our police. That we have to establish a minimum standard and stand true to it and hold it. So when we see officers that are going below that standard, when the disrespect to persons with disabilities is blatant, that there is a fair and realistic repercussion. It can't be that we're going to take this approach of, I was doing it in the name of doing my job and eliminating or ignoring someone in the process. So the training at the academy level, and then training at the level on a routine basis. And I would say even recognizing and giving relevant applause or support to officers when they do make that effort, because I don't want us to leave this conversation thinking that every officer don't care. That's not the reality. Give recognition to the officers that are making a strong effort to be more inclusive, and then ensure that there are appropriate repercussions when the rights of a person with a disability and the adequate respect for someone with a disability who's coming to share in a very vulnerable space is respected and can be provided with the right support. So that goes back to training and putting in the system to ensure that the attitudinal issues don't overshadow the efforts that are made by some officers.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Ms. McCoy, private sector.
The education of our children is not the responsibility of the parents alone, even the Ministry of Education alone, or the other ministries of government. I do believe that the private sector has an important role to play. What is important is that the private sector understands the need to educate themselves in relation to who it is that they are going to be working with, to ensure that their staff, their entire organization understands the needs of the different stakeholder groups that they serve. The other issue that I feel that private sector need to do is to be an active participant in the funding of programs to benefit stakeholder groups. We all live in Jamaica. We all are members of a community, and we all work together in some areas. So the private sector has an important role. They do have expertise that are not necessarily in the government sector that could be utilized to strengthen programs that are out there. So they do have a role to play. Some have been playing it, and I must say, because they have incorporated, especially in relation to disability, they have made efforts to be a little more inclusive, having recognized that this is a mutually beneficial experience, because within an organization, they need people with disabilities to be a part of their cohort as well, to improve their bottom line.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open the floor for questions. I'm looking for hand raise, and we're going to have to close this in about 7 minutes. But just to read some of the comments, I see persons, and I quite agree with you, Ms. Brown, and just having read your messages, clearly you're an advocate. Be intentional in the implementation of data. Research is critical. It's available globally, but we should create our own as well. Be more deliberate, more strategic in sharing, even when it is anecdotal data. It's important to share these lived experiences, certainly. Lead the full and accessible and inclusive application in your spaces. Representation matters. Remuneration for disabled expert services, lived experiences. Let's start reframing the conversation to see the support as investment, not charity.
Yes.
We're not being charitable to anybody. It's an investment for the betterment of all of our countries. And I read earlier that we're talking about disability justice, and persons are saying that they love that term. Be more inclusive about education, not just special education, because we want to ensure that there's integration where necessary and where possible. Funding needs to be established for capacity building and disaggregated collection and reporting. And let me expound on that as well. You're talking about reporting when we see violations across sectors within communities. I think we need to do a little bit more on that, just to add to the point that was said. Continuing with Kimberly Nugent saying that persons with disabilities should have a voice in their own issues because self-representation is key. Erin here is saying again that advocacy training is too important. Too many have not been taught to self-advocate. Parents need to advocate, to support, to foster their children with disability voices so they learn how to authentically speak and self-advocate accordingly. There are some other issues here being highlighted. Yes, agreeing to the point that Ms. Ramit had made earlier, that sometimes these exclusionary criteria is also based on the geographic landscape in Jamaica. It's the rural-urban drift as well. Erin continues to say, recruit persons with disability, and that is important so that they can support policy reform. And closing out with Erin, change the narrative that this is a we conversation. Each of us will and can experience temporary or permanent disabilities through our lifetime. Perfectly said, Erin. Any comments to add to what was shared in the chat? Hand raise. All right, I'm going to ask each panelist absolutely no more than a minute to share their closing remarks. The final comments, and I'll start with you, Ms. Rabbit.
All right. For too long, GBV and women with disabilities have been overlooked in Guyana. And honestly, GCOPD has only recently started focusing more on women with disabilities and their experiences with GBV. And so I hope that through the Spotlight Initiative program and through Spotlight itself, that it is something that we can address with all seriousness and urgency, because it needs urgent attention. And our women with disabilities are suffering. And not only that, but our women who have acquired disabilities as a consequence of violence, they are also being left out of the conversation. And so I hope that we can definitely bridge that gap and address this issue.
All right, perfectly said. Thank you so much. Mrs. Marriott Blake?
Yeah, my first thought is that I do feel that as a country and as a region, there is a lot left to be done, but I want us to be very cautious and to reflect on the efforts that have been made and the strides that we have made. There is a lot more access to information now, and I really encourage any stakeholder who is trying to ensure that information is available to ensure that the information is accessible. Many of us across the region are collecting data. We spoke about the data situation, you know, just based on the comments and in different bits and pieces throughout the conversation. Let's ensure that as we're creating the resources in an effort to support the various communities, that we are making them accessible. Persons with disabilities cannot be advocates if the information that is needed to advocate is not in an accessible format, is not in a digestible format, is not made available to them. And so I am really just encouraging as stakeholders that we look at where we're coming from, look at the data that we have right now, the information we have now, and see how best we can ensure that we are in fact laying that foundation for people to be aware and for people to understand. Let's not assume that the public is uninterested in what we have to say. Let us ensure that the information is made available in a digestible way for the public, as well as for persons with disabilities, because this is, you know, I saw in the comment, this is not a one of us kind of thing. This is a we conversation where everyone needs to be brought to the table and everyone needs to understand. So let's not eliminate any one stakeholder in the name of really zoning in or focusing on a group that we feel is most in need, because whatever we are doing can benefit everyone across the spectrum.
Thank you so much. Ms. McCoy?
Many years ago, there was a buzz term, disability in development. I hardly hear it these days, but if we were true to implementing disability in development, we would be far ahead. What I'm saying is, whatever we do in the public sphere must have a disability focus, and it must also have a GBV focus. I have learned so much about GBV, even preparing for this conversation, and even the members of my organization are more targeted in their approach, whatever programs we put in place, that we ensure that this aspect is included. All the strategies are incorporated in the services that we provide. So I do believe that we really need to get back to basics, and whatever the conversation is going to be, that disability issues are incorporated in that conversation or in that area of focus.
Thank you so much. And I just want to close out by summarizing some key points and inserting some of my own. And I will start at the institutional structural areas. Now, we spoke about those international conventions to which we're signatory. And I would urge each participant, based on your areas of expertise and focus, just to revisit some of these obligations that our governments have made and keep them accountable. I think we need to understand what provisions they are. We have our constitution as well. Let's revisit it. I don't think any country here constitution recognizes disability as a protected characteristics. Jamaica certainly doesn't. A parliamentarian told us recently that they believe the Disabilities Act, which is not even being implemented properly, is sufficient to protecting the rights of persons with disabilities. Jamaica, our group of agencies, I know Mrs. Marriott Blake was a part of that conversation. We have developed a model anti-discrimination legislation that really hones in and zooms in on persons with disabilities rights and protecting them from discrimination. And that is something I really want to urge persons to look at. I believe PANCAP had looked at a model legislation in this regard as well that Caribbean islands can look at. So I know that these are broad, big issues, but sometimes the protection in law is important. I want to encourage persons as well to do what we call budget advocacy. You follow the money. You want to get a sense of how much is being expended, percentage of the gross domestic product along the lines of persons with disabilities. And then you can disaggregate it, how much money is spending on health, how much money is spending on education, and where it is possible, see how much of those sectoral expenditure is towards your particular beneficiaries. And that is what you will use to say, clearly, your public utterance is not being backed up by the money that you're expending to my group of persons that I represent. So budget advocacy, it's something that organizations don't readily understand and do, but it's a conversation I'm hoping UN Women and CIWiL will really look at, because we need to look at how much money is spending towards women, gender-based violence. So no bother with the bag of chat in a parliament, show us your money's worth, so to speak. It's very, very important. And I can tell you, it's something that JFJ has been doing in recent months, and it is working, that parliamentarians get upset with us right now. So it's something to really consider. Follow the money. It's an important concept for us to understand, I believe. It really speaks to accountability and interest. It's done in the HIV sector as well, just to point that out as a point of reference. Now, some of the key recommendations from the group: self-advocacy, self-empowerment, understanding that sense of self. And I think as we reach to the point of self-representation, it's really increasing the capacity of those that we serve so that they can speak for themselves. Really looking at family violence as an area to ensure that the sensitization within the family setting, the community setting, they can be more responsive, treat people better within their families, and certainly be a little bit more aware of the abuses that often take place so that they're not silent bystanders in the situation. Ms. Ramit said it beautifully. consultation is important. And when you don't have a seat at the table, you take that seat. And that is something that I would urge persons to do. You know, as Jamaicans would say, we're back broad. So we need to ensure that we're back broader road and we can demand that seat when it is necessary. Ms. McCoy, you mentioned a best practice that I think I have to highlight. It's something that is important. As nonprofit organizations, we have this feel-good approach about doing our work because a lot of us, we are not in this to make money. And a number of us, we are also representative of the very communities that we serve. So when we speak from a place of experience and not from a place of academia, right? And when I look at the model that you have for economic empowerment, I want to urge NGOs who do that particular area to look at the best practice. I'm coming from a sector that the amount of income generating grants that we issue, complete waste. And I say that without apology because guess what? You train people in income generating grants, you give people money, then the so what is not there. So the money is wasted and we don't really do empowerment in a sustainable way. So what I like is the approach that you move beyond training, but you also do the coaching, but the job placement is something that is so critical. And I'm happy that you can back up what you're saying with data, because it makes no sense that we give people training, give people money, and then the so what isn't there. We don't follow it all the way to the end for it to be really sustainable. So that is something that I would urge, that we think about this market-oriented approach. So it's not the feel good over our hearts, it's in the right place, but we have to get to that stage of sustainable implementation. So I really want to applaud that particular initiative, certainly. There's so many other things that were said, but those were some of the key areas that I wanted to summarize for the participants. And with that said, let us give a thank you to the key panelists, Mrs. Kimberly Sherlock Marriott Blake, Executive Director of the Jamaica Association for the Deaf, Mrs. Marilyn McCoy, or Miss, Executive Director, Jamaica Association on Intellectual Disabilities, and Ms. Rosemary Ramit, Coordinator of the Women and Disabilities Network in Guyana. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you also to you, Mikkel, for guiding us through this very important conversation. As Kimberly mentioned, there's been progress, but there remains a lot of work to do. And I see this particular conversation as a step in reinvigorating that conversation and certainly ensuring that across the region we're able to collaborate with each other to move this work along. So thank you to each of you, to interpreters, and to our very engaged participants for joining this very important discussion. We will certainly be sharing some outcome information from this discussion, and hope that it will be useful to inform advocacy steps going forward. So thank you to everyone. Take good care.